You're listening to the Forum Podcast, a production of Calvin Theological Seminary.
All right, Dr. Thianto, thanks for being here today and welcome to the Forum Podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Leah.
Yeah, I am excited to sit down and talk to you a little bit, not only about your journey, but also the book we're celebrating. But before we get into the book, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your faith journey and then your path into academia. How did God bring you into a teaching career?
Wonderful. Yes. It's a rather long story, of course. You know, I'm old, so I have stories to tell. I was born in Indonesia, as many of you know, and I was born in a Christian family. My parents met when they were at church, and so I have told this story to some people that my parents got married in the oldest church in town that was built by the Dutch in 1753. So it's an 18th century Reformed church. Imagine a smaller version of St. Paul's Cathedral in London.
Oh, wow.
A dome church with the two towers with the clocks. And that church was the only church in town that had the pipe organ.
Wow.
So it's historic church, historically reformed. And I was born there almost. So that was my beginning, and grew up. I grew up as a Christian. My parents taught me Bible stories, and I learned about the Apostles' Creed. I learned the Apostles' Creed in kindergarten, and I kept holding on to it until now. So that's my beginning as a Christian. And all along, I always knew I had the gift of teaching. So imagine me, I was in second grade. My brother was in kindergarten. So we played school after school. And my brother was my only pupil. I was the teacher. And believe it or not, I created a curriculum for him.
I love this.
Math, reading, writing, and other subjects. And I give him tasks, and I give him all kinds of assignments. So my brother, of course, was the smartest kid in his class because of that.
So he just went to school and then went to school again?
Yes. And he couldn't say no. So
no, he can't.
So I already had that since second grade, and I just grew up. And meanwhile, at the same time, I also had, you may call it calling from God. I wanted to talk about the Bible to as many people as I could. Remember, it's Indonesia. Indonesia is the largest country with the largest Muslim population in the world. So we were surrounded by Muslims and people from other religions every day in our lives. So there was this passion. I wanted to teach Bible. I wanted to teach God. Of course, in second grade, I didn't know the word theology at that time, but I wanted to tell the Bible story. I wanted to tell people about Jesus. So that's how it started. So growing up in a Christian home, a gift of teaching, the joy of talking and talking in front of an audience, they all formed me since I was very young. Yeah. So when later in my life I was thinking about going into theology and studying at seminary and so on and so forth, I always had this, again, I call it calling, a conviction in my heart that I want to teach. So I went into seminary after graduating from the university in Indonesia with that in mind already. I was not preparing myself to be a pastor. I was preparing myself to be a teacher, a professor, to be exact. So after the seminary in Indonesia, I came to Calvin in 1992 with that goal. And God has led me thus far. And it has always been a joy for me.
I love that. So you were at Trinity Christian College in Illinois for a while, and then you came to Calvin Seminary about 2 years ago. And since being here, you've been a very influential voice in sharing Indonesia with J-term students, and then you've also started up the monthly mini colloquium. So what have been some of your favorite parts of being a professor here at Calvin Seminary?
The students and being with students. You probably noticed that I'm not just in the classroom and in my office. I love congregating with students outside of the classroom. Teaching in the classroom always gives me the excitement. Some of the students even said this to me, that my battery is recharged while I'm teaching.
Yeah.
There's always a give and take in the classroom, and I draw strength from the students in the classroom. But then outside of the classroom, I also find that joy and excitement. It is always good to hear students' experiences from other classes. I often ask students, what are you reading for the other class? And what have you learned from that reading? Or what do you have to do in that class for an assignment and other activities? So that really is always my high point in being at Calvin Seminary. And also you mentioned the mini colloquium. That's my way of gathering the community. I like gathering people. I like to introduce people to each other and to learn from each other and from their works. So the mini colloquium is my way of making that happen.
Yeah.
So that here on campus, there is a conversation, a lively, healthy conversation built around a professor or faculty member's work or research or publication, so that students can learn and also colleagues too, right? Other professors, staff members, everybody here on campus can learn from what that professor is working or is doing, and then students can get a good model of scholarship, of an academic discourse, interaction with each other, and built around Indonesian food. That is not a bad thing.
Never a bad thing. I love that. You've talked a little bit about, pursuing, asking questions both within your own research, but asking other students questions as well. But over the course of your career, both as a teacher and then as a researcher, what interests have led to you publishing either books or conference volumes, and kind of what excites you outside of the classroom?
Yes, research is a big component in my life since the get-go. Since since I decided that I was going into academia, I knew that research would be a big part of my life, not because I have to, but because I love it.
Yeah.
Because I love it, and of course, as a professor, I need to do my research. I need to update myself in the field, especially in the field of Reformed theology, for the benefits of my students. So first of all, when you look at my work in research, think that I do this for my students first and foremost, so that they can learn from what I do, from what I read, from what I write, and also for the church as a whole, not just in the U.S. but globally. So that is the foundation of my research, and the content itself. Of course, I'm a specialist in 17th century Reformed theology. Well, I love Calvin. Reformed theology starts with Calvin and all the other reformers' works, but then my focus is in the 17th century, because the 17th century is an exciting century. A lot happened, not just in Europe, but also globally, all throughout the world. So I have focused my studies. When I was in the PhD program, I worked under Professor Richard Muller, who is a world-renowned scholar in Calvin and Calvinism. So I studied a lot about Calvin and also the spread of Calvin's teaching, but not just Calvin, but the Reformed theology as a whole in Europe. That was my dissertation subject. I focused on England at that time. But then after I finished my PhD, when I was teaching at Trinity, I expanded my research into the study of the spread of Calvinism in the global south, particularly in what is now Indonesia, because this history is so unique and exciting. Calvinism was brought into the Low Countries, the regions that we call today the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. But then particularly by the Dutch, Calvinism was brought to the East Indies in Asia, Southeast Asia, that later became Indonesia.
Yep.
And that is my roots. So in doing all of this, I was learning and studying about the history of the church and the history of Christianity as I know it. That built and formed my identity.
Yeah.
So I do this work not just for myself, but for number one, for my students, and as I said, to the global church, especially for the church in Indonesia.
Yeah.
Because a lot of Christians in Indonesia do not know their history. They knew that Christianity was brought by the Dutch in the colonial time, but that knowledge stopped there. Not many scholars from Indonesia studying this part of history, and a lot is missing because of that.
Yeah.
So I do this also for the benefit of the church in Indonesia. And as you know, every summer I go to Indonesia to teach, to preach, and also to share my work with the communities there, with Christians and also non-Christians alike, because my study, my research about the history of the church in Indonesia also impacted the universities, the secular universities.
Yeah, definitely.
The faculty and the students there need my work, and so I've been invited to seminar, to lead seminars, to lecture, to do workshops for the students and the faculty at those universities.
I love that. That's awesome. And
Thank you.
Just even to hear how all of your research is connecting you to your roots. It's not just some far off, like, I guess I'm interested in this, but there's no connection to it. It's very, very personal for you. And then you're able to go back and share that with the people you love. And I love that. You wrote a book called An Explorer's Guide to John Calvin. What audience were you kind of hoping to reach with a book like that? And then what kind of gap in knowledge were you trying to fill with that book?
Well, that book is so special because I was not planning to write that book.
Okay.
There's a story behind that. At that time, I was still teaching at Trinity Christian College. At Trinity, I taught Calvin and Calvinism every year. So by that, it happened in 2018. I still remember the year very clearly. 2018, I was attending a conference, the 16th Century Conference, and after I presented my paper, I went to the book display, and there I saw a friend of mine who at that time worked as the editor, one of the editors at IVP.
Okay.
And my friend David there said, well, IVP was starting a new series that is called An Explorer's Guide to, and then you fill in the blank, right? An Explorer's Guide to Karl Barth, an Explorer's Guide to Julian of Norwich. And then David, the editor from IVP, asked me, are you interested in writing one on John Calvin? David said, I know you have been teaching at Trinity and you have been teaching Calvin. And I said, yes. By that time, I already taught Calvin for 15 times. So I have lecture notes, I have research, and a lot of other material under my belt. So without thinking twice, of course, I said yes. That is a wonderful opportunity. And I'm so thankful to David and to IVP for giving me that opportunity. So I dropped everything I was doing. I was already busy with my other research projects, but I dropped everything and I just focused on writing that. So as the name or the title of the book indicates, An Explorer's Guide to John Calvin, it is a guide. It is a guide, and IVP's idea behind this series is that it's not easy to read the writings of Calvin or Karl Barth or any other theologians that have influenced Christianity until today. Their tomes are massive.
Yep.
So audience really need a guide. So the pitch for my book, for an Explorer's Guide to John Calvin, is college students. So I wrote that book with sophomores in college always in my mind. So I pitched that book to them, and I always had my students in the classroom. The questions that they asked me all those 15 years, I taught the subject, the struggles that they underwent as they tried to read Calvin's Institutes. So I kept having them in my mind, and I was writing to them. And my hope is that everybody who already have a college education, they can read this with ease. And my intention, together with IVP's intention, was to really introduce Calvin and to be a guide. This book to be a guide for people who want to know Calvin a little bit more, or people who never know Calvin. And then, so the first part of the book is on Calvin the man, Calvin who was a pastor in Geneva. And then the second book was a step-by-step guide on how to read the Institutes.
Wow, okay. So in effect, you're kind of like writing the textbook for the class that you maybe never had.
Yes, and I never thought about that.
Yeah, it just took that one conversation.
Yes.
I love that. So you write that book, and then now you have a new book that's out.
Yes.
You're the editor on it. So the Old Testament, Calvin and the Reformed Tradition. But this came out of something called the Calvin Studies Society Colloquium. So can you tell me about how this volume came to be and maybe a little bit more about the Calvin Studies Society?
Okay, very good, very good. I'll start with the Calvin Studies Society. Calvin Studies Society is a wonderful society of scholars and pastors who are passionate about Calvin, who want to talk about Calvin, and who want to expand the teaching of Calvin and Calvinism. And the good thing about the society is that it is a blending of scholars and pastors, so that it's not only for the academia, but also for the church. And the conversations at the colloquia are not just about Calvin the man or Calvin and his teaching, but also about the larger Calvinism, right? Reformed theology, Reformed Protestantism. And in line with my passion, it's not just isolated in Western Europe or in North America. It's about the global church.
Absolutely.
So the society holds a colloquia every other year. And this book came out of the colloquium that was done in 2019. Again, at that time, I was still at Trinity. The colloquia are rotated, right? 1 year here at Calvin Seminary, Calvin University, the next time to be in a different university, and then come back here again. So now, for the colloquia, and particularly the colloquium in 2019, the organizer, who there's something here, the vice president of the society is also the organizer of that year's colloquium. I was the vice president at the time, and also the program director of the colloquium in 2019 at Trinity. So I was then also the editor of the book. Because all the sessions are plenary sessions. The organizers invited the speakers, so we identified the speakers who are right for the theme or the topic of the colloquium, and then the papers of at that presentation would be published as a collection of essays. So that's the background, and because of that, then we know that this is an original research by the contributors, and again, the intention of those papers is to advance Calvin and Calvinism. So that's the background, and I was very happy to edit the volume, and Brill in Leiden in the Netherlands agreed to publish this book, this collection of essays. Yeah.
So as an editor, what are some of the unique joys and challenges of being in that role? Because you're not just working with your own material, you're working with other people's material. So how would that go?
Yes, well, it is fun because, of course, I get to learn the works of the contributors. Many of these contributors are friends of mine. We've been friends for decades, so I've known their works rather well. And also, let me explain a little bit more. This the majority of the papers were presented at the colloquium, but to make it a solid collection of essays, I needed to expand the papers. So there were some papers that I asked from other scholars to add to the collection, right? Yep. But now, to answer your question, is that it's exciting because I get to learn about their works. Some of them are really not my area, but they all contributed to the conversation on Calvin and Calvinism and how they look at the Old Testament, certain books of the Old Testament, or certain interpretation of particular books in the Old Testament. That is the excitement and the joy. But of course, editing a work like this is also difficult because each contributor has their own styles of writing, and so having to manage that and to make this a single voice, so to speak, a single voice with multiple timbres.
Yep.
That is a little bit a challenge, and I needed a lot of help from others in editing that work. But yeah, thankfully, that work came out very nicely, I should say.
Yeah. Just in reading the parts that I was able to read, it was so interesting, not only seeing the names, but also seeing how you all kind of worked off of each other in a sense too. Like I'd read an article and they'd be citing someone who had the chapter before or something, and I was like, oh my word, this is so cool. And then even seeing you bring in like worship in India, or not, sorry, Indonesia.
Yeah.
Wow, why did I say India? Yeah. So your article on that, and I was once again connecting back to your roots as a scholar and where you're from. I thought that was so fascinating. You've already kind of highlighted this, but the scholars you worked with, how are your studies and theirs contributing to this broader field of study on John Calvin and the Reformed tradition? Calvin's pretty heavily studied already. So what are you guys kind of adding at this point?
Good question. Yes. Well, I don't think there will be an end to study Calvin, his impact, and Reformed Protestantism as a whole. There will never be an end. There are materials that have not been studied or covered. And each of the contributor brings in their unique perspective. And you also see that I really deliberately included people from other parts of the world. There my friend who wrote on Hungary. And then one from England, and so there are always angles from Calvin himself, his writings, or from Calvinism that we still need to learn about.
Absolutely.
And so, in inviting the speakers for the colloquium back to 2019, I was thinking about that kind of working together, and I also tried to include voices of both men and women, people from Europe, Asia, and America, to be in this conversation. That really enriches the study of Calvin and Calvinism. And we still need that. We still need that, especially in seeing the impacts of Calvin's teaching and his ecclesial practices in other parts of the world. Yeah. So that with that in mind, I gathered the contributors of this volume, and it turned out that they really worked well with the design, and then you can see how the study of Calvin and Calvinism can be seen from this angle. Yeah.
Definitely. So now that the book is published, and you can give the whole thing to someone, but if there was one essay in that book that you could hand to just everybody you knew, which one would it be and why?
Yes, wonderful question. Well, I'm a little biased here, but the work of Christine Coy on the Low Countries. See, because Christine's work and my work complement each other. She does the Low Countries of course, only in Europe, and then I bring what happened in the Low Countries to the East Indies. So there is a good thread between her work and my work. So to answer your question, I would highlight that. Well, I'm sorry if I'm a little selfish because of my own research project.
That's all right.
So that would be it. I would really want people to learn more about that, because especially Christine's work is very unique in introducing or reintroducing people to the Low Countries. That has been understudied, not studied very widely.
Okay.
Again, but please don't misunderstand me. All the contributors are important, and all the papers here will really enrich your knowledge about Calvin and Calvinism.
No, absolutely.
But to answer your question, I would highlight that one.
It would be like asking my parents to pick a favorite child when they love all of us.
Yes.
I get it. No, I also thought that was a very interesting paper that she wrote, and I would hope that more people would read that. As you kind of think about this volume, how would you anticipate it shaping a 21st century reader's study and interpretation of the Old Testament?
Yes, very good. So, first of all, it is very important to preach and to talk about the Old Testament. So it's just the Old Testament itself. And that's why we also, in the Calvin Study Society, we decided for that year, we wanted to focus on the Old Testament. Because oftentimes the Old Testament among Protestants in the 21st century is a little bit pushed to the side or neglected. Sermons and preachings and other venues, right? Bible studies, things like that.
We love the New Testament, but we neglect the Old as a result.
Yeah. That's why, if you look at Scott Manich's paper here on Jeremiah
Yes,
in
that
Geneva.
was fascinating.
I'm so glad you found it fascinating, right? Because Jeremiah the prophet and how important he was in the Old Testament, I rarely hear sermons on Jeremiah.
Yeah, you don't hear him very often.
Not very often. So Scott Manich brought that and connected that to Calvin himself in Geneva. It is a wonderful and fascinating topic here. Right? So that I want people to read this and to see, okay, number one, the Old Testament is important, particularly Jeremiah. Think about Jeremiah, and then think about how Calvin looked at Jeremiah. And so the church today will really benefit from reading Manich's paper here. But also, I can highlight Todd Billings' paper on Calvin's view on the Psalms of Lament. Again, in this day and age, very rarely do we as Christians bring up lament to the foreground. We want a happy Christianity. We always want to have a joyful life, while in reality, life can be sorrowful.
Absolutely.
And the Psalms help us. The Psalms of Lament helps us to be honest in front of God, to cry before God, and to acknowledge our brokenness and the brokenness of the world.
Absolutely.
So Billings' paper helps us to see how Calvin explains lament as distracting emotions. And well, is it a sinful complaint? Of course, the answer is no, it's not sinful. To complain before God is not sinful. But then again, right, for the church today, go back to the Old Testament. Go back to the parts of the Old Testament that modern day Christianity has somehow pushed to the side. And be back to that.
Yeah.
It will help us as
Absolutely.
Christians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we have in the New Testament, all scripture is God-breathed and useful.
Yes.
That includes the portions that are lament. Like, if we're handed the Psalms as the church's worship book, essentially,
Yeah.
the Psalms of Lament are there for a reason. It's not just filler. It's there for us to use.
Yes. And Calvin himself calls the whole psalm is the anatomy of the whole soul. It's an anatomy. The psalm really does that a study of the depth of our soul one by one, including lament.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So even as you're celebrating this book and kind of seeing a 2019 colloquia in paper form, being able to be purchased by other people and seen throughout the world, I would love to know, what are you currently working on that we could maybe anticipate from you in the future? What's exciting to you? What are you researching right now?
If you look at my contribution in this volume, I talk about singing and preaching the Ten Commandments in 17th century Dutch East Indies. So that is a small part of my larger work. Currently, I've been studying the singing of the metrical psalms that got started by Calvin when he was in Strasbourg and then in Geneva. Today we call them the Genevan Psalms. All 150 psalms turned into metrical form, sung in Calvin's Geneva. And then when the Low Countries embraced Calvin's teaching and Calvin's ecclesiastical practices, then they also translated the Dutch Reformed Church also translated the Psalms from French into Dutch. And when the Dutch sailed to the East Indies, they also introduced those Psalms into the East Indies and translated those Psalms into Malay. The lingua franca of the people in the East Indies, right? So my big project right now is tracing the history of psalm singing in the Reformed tradition, particularly looking at how those psalms were translated, introduced, and then sung in the churches in the East Indies.
Wow.
I've been working on this for a long time, for about 10 years now.
Okay.
But then again, I don't call them distractions, but there are projects that are more immediate, like the project on Explorer's Guide to John Calvin. For 2 years, when I was writing that book, I didn't work on my psalm singing, right? But also to give you more information here is that Calvin's Geneva didn't just turn the psalms into the metrical form to be sung, but also some songs in the Bible, like the Song of Mary, the Song of Zechariah, the Song of Simeon in the book of Luke, and also the Ten Commandments. Were turned into a metrical form and then sung, the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed.
Yep.
Right? So my paper in this collection of essays talked about the singing of the Ten Commandments and also how the Ten Commandments were preached in the East Indies. But my book, it will be my next book, is about that, about the transplantation of singing the metrical psalm in the East Indies.
That's fascinating. Well, we'll look forward to having you back on the podcast when that comes out. But
Thank
in
you.
the meantime, congratulations on the Old Testament, Calvin, and the Reformed tradition, and thanks for being on the Forum Podcast today.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you for inviting me and for hosting this.
You're very welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.